What's up, folks? I'm Chris, your NFL writer here at Occupy Fantasy, here with a look at today's single game showdown slate between the New Orleans Saints and Los Angeles Chargers on Sunday, August 20th. One of just two games remaining here in preseason week 2. Right off the bat, there is another variable to be aware of tonight before you prepare to submit any lineups for tonight's showdown slate. There is a hurricane bearing down on Los Angeles, Hurricane Hillary. A lot of other professional sporting events have either been postponed entirely or moved because of that hurricane. No word yet from the NFL on their plans for this game. So as of right now, we are preparing for this game to take place at the exact same time and place, but things could change closer to the anticipated scheduled start time. So just keep an eye out on that here. Preseason football, this game is a 37-point total, and the Saints are favored by 3.5 points. With a low total like that, two of the safest plays on the board for you are going to be the defenses. We have, obviously, Chargers defense, and then the favored side, Saints defense. Our first position group, our first of 5 top plays for tonight. The defenses on both sides. Each of these two teams has 2 kickers splitting duty. So Dustin Hopkins returned to practice for the Chargers during joint practices this week, which means unlike last week when Cameron Dicker was the only kicker for the Chargers in their game against the Rams, both of these guys are expected to get some reps as far as we can tell based off of practice reports. And each of Will Lutz and Blake Group here actually had kicks in the last preseason game for the Saints. So I would not play either of these guys in shutout tonight, just the defenses as top units. Now at the quarterback position, people are going to look at the snaps played last week, 64% for Easton Stick, 36% for Max Duggan, and the field is probably going to concentrate on Easton Stick. Easton Stick is going to get a half tonight. Max Duggan is going to get the second half. That's what we're anticipating once again here. The Chargers under Brandon Staley have done this repeatedly in the preseason, so this is what we're expecting once again. No expectation that Chargers starters are going to get any reps whatsoever in this game. Stick and Duggan did get a half each last week. It's just there were more offensive plays for the Chargers in the first half. So do side with Easton Stick having a little bit more upside, playing with the better players in the first half of the game. But we can't ignore Max Duggan's rushing upside. He had 4 rushes in limited snaps last week, and he will have a chance to do that again here against the Saints. Now on the Saints side, there's a little bit of news that we have that I don't think is being baked into some of the early projections, some of the early things you can look at, like some of the higher or lower stats that companies like Underdog put out for you to put on some pick'em slip entries. Derek Carr is not going to play tonight. New Orleans.football beat writer for the Saints, Nick Underhill, very, very good at his job, answered some questions from some users on Twitter yesterday and said that he doubts many of the starters are going to play tonight in response to one of those questions, and followed that up with a no chance that Derek Carr is going to be one of those starters that sees action in this game. So we can rule out Derek Carr right off the bat here, and probably most of the Saints starters that we're expecting to play with Derek Carr in the regular season. That would be guys like Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, maybe even Jamal Williams, because Jamal Williams might have to start while Kamara is out for 3 games due to his suspension. So we're expecting run from the Saints' second and third units exclusively in this game. And that obviously brings to the forefront of conversation here, Jameis Winston played a decent bit in last week's game, had pretty good results. We're taking a little bit of a leap of faith that the Saints are actually going to play their third unit pretty heavily here in preseason week 2. So last year, they played their quarterback 3 on 86% of offensive snaps in preseason week 2. We don't have any firm reporting that is the plan tonight, but we are going out on a limb and we're going to assume that Jake Haener has more playing time upside than Winston. We know Carr's not going to play, so as soon as Winston exits the game, Haener is going to have quite a few reps because he's going to finish the game. There's nobody else behind him as quarterback in camp for the Saints. So we like Jake Haener as a really, really strong play on this slate. I think he has 2+ quarter upside in this game for New Orleans. Speaking of New Orleans, at the running back position, Ellis Merriweather led the Saints in snaps last week, played 41% of snaps. Jamal Williams did play last week. Some of the starters did play last week, got 23% of snaps. If we assume Jamal Williams is resting, that should be more work for Ellis Merriweather, Kendre Miller, and newly signed Darrell Williams, formerly of the Chiefs and Arizona Cardinals. Darrell Williams just got there for the Saints, so I don't think he's going to have a tremendous amount of work in this game. So I would be very skeptical that he sees a ton of action. Kendre Miller, coming off of a knee injury, returned to practice, was wearing a brace, wasn't going through team drills, was working off to the side based off the last couple of practice reports. Unclear if Miller is going to be available. What we can tell you is that Merriweather is going to be the most popular running back play on the Saints and probably on the slate in general. The Chargers running back room is pretty messy. There's 4 guys who could play. We're not expecting Austin Eckler. Last week, Isaiah Spiller played the most. Joshua Kelly had the most touches. And Elijah Dotson here ripped off 2 touchdowns on 6 touches. So the playing time for these guys was between 11 and 36% of snaps. We don't expect these running backs to see much of an increase or decrease in playing time. This is kind of how the Chargers use their running backs in the preseason. Expect these guys to get about a quarter each. Kind of a roulette wheel, so to speak, here if you're going to be playing a Chargers running back. We'll keep an eye out for any pregame news that shifts this if some more guys are inactive than we are expecting, though. One thing to be aware of, Larry Roundtree of the Chargers played last week on 22% of snaps. He was waived. He's not on the team anymore, and they signed Aaron Shamklin, was in camp last year with the Dallas Cowboys, to take his spot at the back half of the running back rotation. So there's still the same number of running backs. Now, the wide receiver position. I'm going to start with the Saints, and then we'll go to the Chargers after that. There are several players we can rule out right off the bat, I think. Chris Olave and Michael Thomas, the starters, probably not going to be playing at all. Rashid Shaheed has not been practicing. He's likely out tonight. Traquan Smith also has not been practicing, likely out tonight. Kirk Merritt, listed as a wide receiver here, has actually been seeing some running back work for the Saints. A little unclear if he's going to be back or not, but he would be an interesting play at running back if we can get some confirmation he's going to be out there tonight. Lynn Bowden returned to practice on Friday after missing practice on Thursday, so a little unclear what's going on with Lynn Bowe here. So it leaves us with a very, very thin wide receiver room for the Saints because we're expecting rookie A.T. Perry had a really, really big game last week. Brian Edwards, who led the Saints in snaps at wide receiver last week. We do expect those guys to play a ton again here, but everything else behind that is super unclear here tonight. Perry, by far, going to be the most popular play here, especially after the success he had last week. He had 6 targets, 70 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Led the Saints in air yards, had a 8.5-yard average depth of target, ran most of his routes from outside wide receiver positions. So the Saints' day 3 draft pick here with a tremendous amount of upside once again, but he'll be popular after last week's showing. Brian Edwards, veteran of preseasons past, previously of the Raiders and the Falcons. He led the Saints in snaps last week, and looking at what the Saints do historically in the preseason, in 2022, for this coaching staff, the snap leader at wide receiver in week 1 was their snap leader at wide receiver for all 3 of their preseason games. So Brian Edwards, we can safely assume he's going to play a lot tonight. Will he get a ton of opportunities? That does remain to be seen. He had 5 targets, so just one shy of A.T. Perry's total last week. Did not do nearly as much with his targets as A.T. Perry, but has the opportunity and the upside there with a similar average depth of target and role on the outside as a wide receiver for the Saints here in week 2 of the preseason. Kawan Baker also played a lot last week. I think he will be overlooked in favor of Perry and Edwards. He would be the other wide receiver I think is interesting. Runs more of his routes out of the slot and should be available for a little bit more work if there's any concern with Lynn Bowden, who had been banged up earlier in the week in practice. That's a little bit of speculation by me, though, for sure. The Chargers side here. Now, everyone is going to look at what happened last week, and they're going to pile on to 2 wide receivers who played over 70% of the snaps last week. Doss played 73% of the snaps last week. He had 4 targets, and he ran the majority of his routes in outside wide receiver positions. Bynum played 70% of the snaps, also had 4 targets last week, and ran an even higher percentage of his routes on outside wide receiver positions, similar average depth of target to Keelan Doss. The thing to be aware of, though, with these 2 is we're not confident that they're going to see the same amount of playing time here against the Saints because there's a lot of moving parts with the Chargers wide receiver room. There are some injured players who didn't play last week that should play some more. The biggest one to be aware of is John Hightower. There's been a ton of reports of Hightower lighting up Chargers camp. Chargers joint practices, and he returned to practice this week. Didn't practice last week, so he was unavailable for game 1 against the Rams. He's available tonight. Hightower is a deep threat type wide receiver. That's what he was with the Eagles. So this is an interesting high-risk play, I think, tonight. So if the field has not been paying attention to the practice reports, if they are unaware of the fact that John Hightower has been practicing with Easton Stick and some of those guys that'll play in the first half tonight potentially, he might become a really interesting high-risk wide receiver play on this slate. Be remiss if I didn't mention Quentin Johnston. Only played 31% of the snaps in the opening preseason game for the Chargers here, but they fed him. They gave him 6 targets. He was targeted on 50% of his routes before they decided to throw a touchdown pass to him and end his day. It's unclear if he will now be grouped in with the starters for the Chargers and rest, or continue to play here with Easton Stick in the second and third units. I would consider Johnston a little more high risk in this game. Looking at the trends around the league, we know that some of these rookie wide receivers get a lot of exposure early in the preseason, just kind of their welcome to the NFL moment, and then they may be rested in the second and third weeks as they prepare for the season. So a little bit of speculation by me here. I think QJ is expected to have a regular season role for the Chargers, so far more high risk than some of these other guys that we've talked about so far in this video. So I'm not really worried about any of the tight ends tonight. They don't historically do well in showdown contests, so I don't have a tight end play for you, but that's a little bit on the running backs, quarterbacks, wide receivers, and that should be enough for you to build out some high-risk lineups. Have some fun in preseason DFS tonight. I will not let you out of here without my less than 5% owned wide receiver call of the night, and it wouldn't be an Occupy preseason video brought to you by me if I didn't find a way to talk about an all-star from spring football. Tonight we have Jontre Kirkland, formerly of the Houston Roughnecks. Kirkland got hurt in the middle of the XFL season, and it actually derailed the Roughnecks campaign. He was the best wide receiver that they had. Kirkland played 5 games for the Roughnecks. In the 5th game, he got injured pretty early. He put up 15 receptions for 253 yards and 4 touchdowns in his 4 full games that he got to play for the Houston Roughnecks at a really, really juicy 14.3 yard average depth of target. Suspect the Saints may only have 7 total wide receivers available to play. Some of the guys I talked about at the front end of the video, like A.T. Perry, Brian Edwards, and Kawan Baker, we expect them to play early with Jameis Winston. Once Jake Haener comes into the game, and once again, we're expecting Haener to play 2+ quarters tonight, I would suspect that Kirkland is in the rotation of wide receivers that gets to play with that third quarterback, Jake Haener, and this is not someone that the field is necessarily looking at with a tremendous amount of upside. So my favorite low-owned play tonight, high risk, large field, have some fun with it. Jontre Kirkland, XFL All-Star from the Houston Roughnecks, looking to prove he deserves a spot somewhere in the National Football League, probably in the second half tonight. Good luck tonight, folks, if you're playing preseason DFS between the Saints and the Chargers, and we will be back tomorrow to talk to you about the final game of preseason week 2, Ravens and Commanders.